to support the new clauses and amendments moved by my friend from North East Fife earlier today, but I also wish to speak in particular to new clause 51 in the name of the honourable gentleman, the member for Pontypridd. And in particular, I wish to support the argument that the white paper must and should include details of the expected trajectory for the UK balance of trade, GDP and unemployment. And I think we saw a number of contributions earlier today that would explain precisely why we need that. First was my honourable friend from North East Fife, who said that the Vote Leave campaign failed to provide detailed answers to any of the key economic questions before the referendum. And of course he's right. But there was also the contribution from the right honourable gentleman, the member for Forest of Dean, who is no longer in his place. And I think he demonstrated incredibly ably the confusion at the heart of the Vote Leave campaign and why decision-taking today is incredibly difficult. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, and I've said this to him, so there's no surprise to him, he effectively said no one in the leadership of the official Leave campaign ever argued that we would join the EEA or have an EFTA-type agreement. Now, it may have been that the right honourable gentleman, the member for Surrey Heath, or one of these other senior figures never quite said that, but to argue the Leave campaign did not suggest that and suggest it strongly is simply wrong. The Leave campaign lawyers for Britain said we could apply to rejoin with effect from the day after Brexit. After membership would allow us to continue uninterrupted free trade relations, etc. That was still on their website only a few weeks ago. The former ambassador and Brexit supporter Charles Crawford appeared on Newsnight and argued an EEA option may be the first step in Brexit. Roland Smith, the author of The Liberal Case to Leave, wrote an extended paper entitled Evolution Not Revolution, the case for the EEA option. So I suspect there were many people who indeed voted for Brexit, believing that we weren't voting for a hard Tory cliff edge Brexit, that we would maintain membership of the EEA or EFTA or an equivalent. And I think, given that that now no longer appears to be the case, then it's absolutely right, as the honourable gentleman's motion, a new clause makes clear, that we have details of the expected trajectory of the balance of trade, GDP and unemployment. I'll make a little progress then I will. But these are not abstracts, Mr Howarth. They are at the heart of the measurement of our economy, of wages, of living standards, of economic growth. They are the platform for tax yield, which pays for our vital public services. And all of those words and concepts were almost entirely absent from what I'll call generously the first white paper. But before I make progress, let me just observe gently that it's not good enough for the government to produce a white paper after a referendum, after sets of votes, which is little more than the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech, dressed up with a few pictures and a couple of graphs. This is not the basis for the economic plan necessary to mitigate the huge potential damage to the economy from a hard Tory Brexit. And make no mistake, that is what we're facing, and I'll happily give way.
For giving away this very quick intervention. To say, did the government leaflet, great cost, not exactly make this point, that single market membership was not on option, but it was access that would be the result of the referendum and a Leave vote?
Well, there may have been many things said, and that's the point I'm making. There was access to the single market. Some might argue being in the EEA, a member of EFTA, precisely gives one not just access, but membership of. One could call it access if one likes. So there was deep confusion in the messaging of the no side, which must be rectified now with proper details on the trajectory of the key economic numbers before more decisions are taken. Now, I said we're facing a hard Brexit. Let's understand what it is that has been said. The leaked Treasury document last November suggested the UK could lose up to 66 billion from a hard Brexit. The GDP could fall by around 9.5% if the UK reverted to WTO rules. This is worst-case scenario. I accept that. but nevertheless, without a plan to mitigate that, should the circumstances occur which lead us to that catastrophe, then the guilt would be on the part of the government for failing to plan. And of course, the last part of that, if we revert to WTO rules, is key. Key because the Prime Minister has said a bad deal is worse than no deal. But that's very twisted logic, Mr Howarth, because no deal is the worst deal. It means we do revert immediately to WTO rules, with all the tariffs and other regulatory burdens that implies. But of course, the leaked Treasury document wasn't published in isolation. The LSE, the Centre for Economic Performance, published very similar numbers. They said, in the long run, reduced trade lowers productivity, already a huge problem for the UK. They said that the increased cost of Brexit would lead to a loss of between 6.3 and 9.5% of GDP. And they put a range of figures on that, between £4,200 and £6,500 per household. And I think when we consider that impact, in terms of the impact on real people, it begins to have a substantial measure of strength to the argument. And the figures in Scotland, independently produced by the Fraser-Valander Institute, are in line with those other assessments. They suggest a hard Brexit could result in the loss of some 80,000 Scottish jobs within a decade, and a drop in wages of averaging around £2,000. I don't think anyone, any politician of any party, would willingly say, let's embark on a course of action which will lead to the near impoverishment of many people in society. But that is where we are with the hard Tory Brexit argument. And when we, I can hear the groans, Mr Howarth. We had year after year of long-term economic plan which failed at every turn. I think it's better if we argue that what we're facing today is a hard Brexit, a cliff-edge Brexit, and prepare for it. That makes sense. And if we add to that, add to the assessments which have already been done, today's report that senior executives in the FTSE 500 companies tell us that the Brexit vote is already having a negative impact on business. That should have alarm bells ringing throughout government. Instead, there is simply complacency. Or the British Chamber's report telling us almost half of businesses surveyed have already seen a hit to margins due to the devaluation caused by the fear of Brexit, with more than half suggesting they will have to increase prices. Now, all the more reason to have the kind of assessment and understanding of the trajectory of many of the key metrics and the plans to mitigate the worst impact. And all of that, Mr Howarth, is before we get to the vexed question of balance of trade. A current account for the last full year, 80 billion in the red. A deficit in the trade in goods, 120 billion in the red. Yet we are faced with a Brexit which will make this worse, ripping the UK and Scotland out of the world's largest and most successful trading bloc. And to do this without the clear assessment asked for of the damage and any credible plan to mitigate it, included in a comprehensive white paper, is, in my view, Mr Howarth, an act of wilful economic vandalism.